Good evening. Thanks for joining us. We understand there was a really bad accident, so there'll be some latecomers straggling in as we get started, so sorry for that inconvenience. My name is Melissa Giller. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you for being here this evening. In honor of the men and women around the world who defend our freedom, if I could ask for you to please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So before we get started, just a few people in the audience I would like to recognize, of course, starting with our former Congressman Elton Gallegly and his wife Janice. Thank you for being here today. And my boss, the president and CEO of the Reagan Foundation and Institute, Mr. David Trulio. So we are gathered here less than 2 weeks before Election Day, which means presidential politics is on all of our minds, no matter how much we might try to get away from it. And as we have all seen, when presidents and candidates in both parties want to bolster their campaigns or their arguments, they often invoke wisdom from the past. And they often quote President Reagan. That's a testament to his place in our history and to the timelessness of his values. In his day, President Reagan also believed in learning from his predecessors, and not just from Republicans. He was once asked to name the last American leader he had a great deal of faith in. To the surprise of many, he cited Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Reagan explained it like this. He said, "He took his case to the people. The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets the people to do the greatest things." President Reagan would also invoke former presidents in more humorous ways. In a discussion about his age, Ronald Reagan channeled our third president. He quoted, "Thomas Jefferson once said, 'We should never judge a president by his age, only by his works.' And ever since he told me that, I stopped worrying." Ronald Reagan was as disarming as he was insightful. Now, we can all learn from our former presidents, and not just Presidents Reagan, Roosevelt, and Jefferson. Their advice and example are relevant for everyone, not just those who sit behind the resolute desk. And that is the message of our guest tonight. Now, before we get to the book, let me tell you a few things about Talmage Boston, because I found his biography fascinating. He's a well-known figure among historians. He's an author, a speaker, an onstage interviewer. His work has been endorsed by David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Jon Meacham, and Douglas Brinkley. But somehow, he also manages to lead a second career. He is one of the most highly recognized lawyers in Texas, working as both a full-time commercial litigator and a full-time historian. And tonight, of course, is about his work as a historian. His latest book, of course, How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Hope you've bought your copy. Now, rather than just recounting what these presidents achieved, he goes deeper. He looks at how they did it, what traits made them successful. And by them, I mean the presidents he covers in the book. Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Kennedy, Eisenhower, both Roosevelts, and of course, President Reagan. Talmage, we thank you for joining us tonight, and we thank you for shedding new light on the leadership of our 40th president. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Reagan Library stage, Talmage Boston. So thank you for joining us today. We'll start really easy. What made you choose this topic for your book, and how did you narrow it down to these 8 presidents who were in the book?
Well, this book is what I call a study in applied history. I suspect everybody who's here enjoys history, studies it, which is all great. But I think it's most important for us to think of ways to apply history to our daily living. That's why I had John Avlon write the foreword, because his 2 books, one on Washington's farewell address as well as Lincoln's final weeks, that the road to peace until his unfortunate assassination, are always thinking in terms of how can I talk about this history in ways that are relevant to today? And so this book is what I call a combination leadership / presidential history book. The target audience is anybody who is or aspires to be a better leader in any field of endeavor: business, law, entertainment, nonprofits, politics. These leadership traits demonstrated by our 8 greatest presidents are timeless and go across the board regardless of what type of organization you may be involved with. So that was the appeal. I've always thought in terms of how can we apply history to today. I'm a contributing columnist for the Dallas Morning News, and my angle is typically to talk about presidential history in the context of today's presidential politics and how there's so many ties that we need to be mindful of. In terms of how did I choose the 8 presidents who are the subject of the book, who I call our 8 greatest presidents, it's largely tied to the C-SPAN television network presidential ranking poll. Every time a president leaves the White House and a new one comes in, C-SPAN does a ranking poll of the country's 150 leading historians and asks them to rank the presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential leadership traits. So if you Google C-SPAN presidential ranking poll, you can read all about it, what the traits were and what the results the last several times. But the last 2 times they've done the poll, 2017 when Obama left and Trump came in, 2021 when Trump left and Biden came in, the results of the poll were identical as to presidents 1 through 9. 1 Lincoln, 2 Washington, 3 FDR, 4 Theodore Roosevelt, 5 Eisenhower, 6 Truman, 7 Jefferson, 8 Kennedy, 9 Reagan. So the only adjustment that I made to the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll, I think Truman's overrated. He got us into Korea and had no idea how to get us out. He was unsuccessful at dealing with McCarthyism. He gets credit for dropping the A-bombs and bringing a prompt into World War II. That was the only decision he could have made. Plan B was to invade Japan, which would have required the loss of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. So I think Truman's overrated. The best thing that ever happened to Harry Truman was David McCullough wrote a wonderful biography of him. So I pulled him out. I think Reagan's underrated, certainly deserves to be in the top 8. So that's part 1 of my answer. Part 2 of my answer is I'm hoping to sell my book to both Democrats and Republicans. And so in the modern era, I wanted there to be 2 great Democratic presidents, FDR and JFK, and 2 great Republican presidents in Eisenhower and Reagan. And then part 3 of my answer is in 2024, this horrible polarization has been going on for so long and nobody seems to be able to do much about it. I want to do my part and ask Democrats to read and recognize that we've had great Republican presidents, and I want Republicans to read and recognize that we've had great Democratic presidents. And let's take down these walls that cause people to form their opinions based on whether somebody's a member of one party or the other. Let's just focus on the greatness and the great things that were done for our country because of that greatness. And so that's why I chose my 8 and feel like if it causes people to rethink their polarization, that it will be a worthy effort. Thank you. Thank you.
So this isn't your first book on presidential history, and I was curious what got you so interested in presidential history.
I grew up in Houston, and I was there, and I was 6 years old when it was announced that Major League Baseball was coming to Houston, the Houston Colt 45s, who 3 years later became the Astros. And I was a nut about baseball cards and everything baseball. And when you're 6 years old, as you know, your brain is a sponge. You remember everything, unlike today when it's hard to remember anything. So anyway, my mother became very concerned that on the one hand, she had this smart little 6-year-old boy, but on the other hand, his head was filled with nothing but baseball statistics from the back of the baseball cards. And so for my 7th birthday, she went to a bookstore and she found a booklet that contained presidential trading cards that were exactly the same size as baseball cards. You had the picture of the president on the front, on the back, when was he born, when was he died, when was he president, what were the most important things that happened in his life. And just like the baseball cards, I immediately memorized everything that was on the back of the. So by the time I'm in the first and second grade, I can recite all the presidents in order and all this. People are impressed. And so in the early 1960s, when I was in grade school, is when America was celebrating the centennial of the Civil War. And so there are a lot of television documentaries and other children's books. And of course, the great hero was Lincoln. And so I became fascinated with all things related to Lincoln and soon the presidency. And so I started young. My first two books were on baseball history. But after I finished the second one, I realized I had written about everything in baseball that I truly cared about. So my third book was what I call a lawyer inspiration book. My profession has justifiably received a whole lot of criticism over the last few decades, much of it tied to Nixon and Watergate. And I wanted to write something that would make lawyers mindful that, no, we really have a great history. We need to be proud of what we've done as well as what we do now. So that book was called Raising the Bar, the Crucial Role of the Lawyer in Society, that the State Bar of Texas published. But then I moved on to what had been my love since 7-year-old birthday, and that is presidential history. So one of the things that I do is in Dallas once a month, when a historian is coming through town on their book tours, I do onstage interviews with them. And so I've gotten to know our leading presidential historians. Their names are on the back of my dust jacket. I help them, now they're helping me. And so I would do these interviews and record them and then have the transcripts prepared, and then I'd edit the transcripts to make them as readable as possible, take out the uhs and the you knows and tighten it up, and then give every historian an opportunity to make any final edits or tweaks. So anyway, that book was called Cross-Examining History. A Lawyer Gets Answers from the Experts About Our Presidents. And it was at least one major historian of our most significant presidents. I count 20 significant presidents. That includes people like Herbert Hoover, who was not a great president, but I always say a significant president. He was president during the Great Depression started. But also the interviews with leading White House insiders, Henry Kissinger, James Baker, Lyndon Johnson Robb, John Sununu, Andy Card, but it was mainly historians. So anyway, that provided the springboard for this book, and I've already got something in mind as soon as Election Day is over and I move into a mode of promoting this book less and less and focusing on the next book, which will be another presidential history book, and maybe if I behave myself, I can come back in 4 years.
And I have to know, do you still have the presidential trading cards?
I do.
Oh!
I do.
Do you add your collection every 4 years?
Yeah, although, you know, that set of cards was printed in 1960, so
wow.
You know, that publisher is out of business.
Wow.
But it's fun. One of the many great things about the internet is what you can find that you didn't know still was around.
Okay, so let's get into your book. You start your book with a quote by Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'm going to read it. The quote says, "The one quality that can be developed by studious reflection and practice is the leadership of men." So 2 questions. Why did you choose that quote? And it made me wonder, how much of leadership do you truly think one can learn versus how much of leadership is sort of inherently born within a person?
I chose the quote because it's a statement about applied history. That this is stuff that if you study about and think about and practice enough, you can come around and start doing these things. You may not do them as well as Ronald Reagan, but you can be better than you are by understanding how Reagan and these other great presidents went about their business. At the end of every one of my 8 chapters on the 8 presidents is what I call personal application, which is a series of questions for the reader to ask him or herself, how am I doing in these leadership traits that I just read about in this chapter on Reagan or Washington or Jefferson? And so the Eisenhower quote was absolutely tied to this idea that hopefully is more than an idea, this reality that the more you study greatness in presidential politics, the more likely you are to be a great president. As you mentioned, Reagan adored Franklin Roosevelt for good reason. He voted for him all 4 times. Later, when Reagan left the Democratic Party, he said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. But there were so many things. In fact, in the Reagan chapter, I have a series of bullet points, the incredible number of similarities between Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. And Reagan liked to quote Franklin Roosevelt in his speeches. I mean, he was a bona fide hero. And like Franklin Roosevelt, he was great as a matter of public oratory, but he was also great as a matter of a calm voice on the radio that enhanced his connection with the American people. So do I think this stuff can be learned and taught? Yes. Yes, it's great to have certain natural traits that increase the likelihood that you'll be an effective leader. But people obviously think many of these traits can be learned, improved, so on. Go to any bookstore and say, show me the books on leadership. There's tons of them. There's always been tons of them, and that's because people truly believe that the more you study our great leaders, the more likely you are to have a good idea of what you need to do to be a great leader. I mean, it's like if you want to be a great basketball player, read up on Michael Jordan. If you want to be a great singer, read up on Barbra Streisand. If you want to be a great president, read up on our greatest presidents. So I feel very strongly that these are things any leader, whether you're aspiring president or aspiring president of your company or your nonprofit or whatever, that you start thinking about these things. For example, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson came in a very divided country after John Adams' very divisive presidency, where we'd had the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anybody to criticize President Adams or any Federalist policy. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired by its own terms at the end of Adams' term. But here's Jefferson. Day one of his presidency, the country's totally divided. And in his inaugural address, he says, look, folks, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, i.e. we're all Americans, and we better start thinking that way or else this country isn't going to make it. And so he implements these Jefferson dinners, 2 to 3 dinners every week for 8 years, where he brings Federalists and Republicans and serves them lots of wine and great food. But there's a rule. We will not talk about hot button issues. We'll talk about history, literature, music, our families, what we do for a living. We'll talk about what people talk about when they want to be friends. That's how you build relationships. Politics is relationships. That was one of the greatest traits of Ronald Reagan. That's why there were so many Reagan Democrats. That's why he totally blew away Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, because he knew how to cross the aisle. He knew how to build rapport with people on both sides of the aisle. And that all stems, the great start of this movement was really Thomas Jefferson and these Jefferson dinners. Google Jefferson dinners. There's a movement in this country now for people to get together, be able to have civil discourse and show mutual respect and show that even if we may disagree on some political issues, we can have great fellowship and great friendship. And Reagan got that, and that's why he was such a master of building this national consensus in support of so many of his policies. And Jefferson really set the tone. And of course, Lincoln set the tone, and Franklin Roosevelt, tons of Republicans were supporting him. So Reagan, as a student of history, knew what the great presidents had done to get this broad-based support that unfortunately seems to have slipped away from us in the 21st century.
Yeah. So speaking of Ronald Reagan, we are going to turn everyone's attention to that screen over there for just a minute.
There's a story that maybe some of you know, and I just can't resist at this point telling it, because it has to do with the definition of optimism. A man who had 2 sons, and he was very disturbed about them. One was a pessimist beyond recall. The other one was an optimist beyond reason. He talked to a child psychiatrist who made a suggestion. He said, I think we can fix that. He said, we'll get a room and we'll fill it with the most wonderful toys any boy ever had. And he said, we'll put the pessimist in. And when he finds out they're for him, he'll get over being a pessimist. And his father said, what do you do about the optimist? Well, he said, I have a friend who's got a racing stable, and they clean out the stalls every morning. And he said, I can get quite an amount of that substance. And he said, we'll put that in another room. And when the optimist, who's seen his brother get all those toys, is then shown into that room, and that's there, he'll get over being an optimist. Well, they did, and they waited about 5 minutes, and then they opened the door, and the pessimist was sitting there crying as if his heart would break. He said, I know somebody's going to come in and take these away from me. And they went down to the other room and they opened the door, and there was the kid, happy as a clam, throwing that stuff over his shoulders as fast as he could. And they said, "What are you doing?" He says, "There's got to be a pony in here somewhere."
That story is in my book. Reagan told that so many times it became kind of a joke because he loved the story. So whenever I'm talking to an audience and I want to really connect with the audience, I tell that story. And invariably people laugh, they love it. And I think it's because, which, the main trait as far as Reagan's greatness was his sense of optimism. And not only that he was personally an optimist, but that he inspired optimism to everybody who was around him. And in this case, the United States of America and Americans coming out of the malaise of the Jimmy Carter presidency. But this wonderful museum, you read about his childhood. I mean, his parents didn't have any money. They moved from rent house to rent house. His father was an alcoholic, not exactly what you'd call a role model. He had this wonderful mother who was always boosting him up with optimism. But from day one, Reagan just has this dynamic optimism. And that's why he loved to tell that story, because it says everything about the nature, the difference between the optimist and the pessimist. I mean, one of the things in reading about his first presidential election against Jimmy Carter, Carter had really been a pessimistic president. I mean, he acted like our best days are gone, we're not coming back, everybody needs to lower their expectations. And Reagan hated that thought. And in fact, one historian says he hated pessimists as much as he did communists. And I think that's, I don't want to spend my time with pessimists, because pessimists don't move any mountains. Only optimists move mountains. And he got it. And that's why he was such an amazing president. And I'm so glad I'd never seen the video of that. I've read of it, I've never seen the video.
And as you said, he told it so many times. There's, a zillion speeches where that story's in. But,
and it always worked.
Yeah.
It always worked.
So in the chapter about George Washington, and you're talking about his leadership traits, you mentioned two leadership traits that are actually my favorite traits in a leader, the ability to learn from your mistakes and the importance of humility. How did Washington embrace those traits?
Well, his mistakes took place, for the most part, when he was a soldier, and obviously lived in America, but we hadn't had our independence. So he's with the British Army, and they're fighting the French and the Indians in the French and Indian War, and he's incredibly courageous. He has horses shot out from under him. He has bullet holes in his hat and his uniform. It was a providential miracle that George Washington survived the French and Indian War. And he would lead men into battle and bullets flying everywhere, and somehow he never got hit. But he was pretty proud of what he was doing, so he became a real aggressive self-promoter and kept reaching out to his British superiors to raise his rank and give him more recognition, and they kept rejecting him. And he kept doing it, he kept rejecting it. So the first trait on George Washington, learned from his mistakes. After that French and Indian War, nobody ever accused him of being a self-promoter before. In fact, he was the exact opposite. He never campaigned for any major office, and yet, here's the guy who got chosen unanimously to be the head of our Continental Army during the American Revolution, unanimously to be the chairman of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, unanimously by the voters and electors to be first-term president, and unanimously second-term president, without ever campaigning or promoting himself. So that was obviously huge, and that's why he's one of the many reasons he's so favorably remembered, because people don't think of him as being a self-promoter, saying this is a guy who left the Continental Army and went back to Mount Vernon. And the King of England said, well, he must be the greatest man in the world. I mean, if you just led our American military to victory in the Revolution, most people would want to just keep on being the head of the country. And he went back to Mount Vernon. And then, of course, after his second term, he does the same thing. He could have had a third term, but he said, no, I'm ready to go back to Mount Vernon. He was relinquishing. He was the exact opposite. And so, and that's part of the the humility. It's like, no, I'm not aspiring to be in the business of grabbing power or holding on to power beyond my time. And I'm ready for successors to do their part and spend their time at the head. So those traits are actually linked.
Mm-hmm. Now, in each chapter, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, you talk not just about the leadership attributes that are great about the president, you also mention some of their flaws. Mm-hmm. And in Thomas Jefferson's chapter, you quote Jon Meacham, and you say, Jefferson represents the best of us and the worst of us. Can you explain that?
Well, anybody who's read much about Thomas Jefferson knows that there's a real basis. I mean, on the one hand, Declaration of Independence contains the American creed, all men are created equal, great third president, Louisiana Purchase, brilliant political thinker, founder of the University of Virginia. So many reasons to admire the life and work of Thomas Jefferson. I've talked about how he brought the country together through these dinners that brought the walls down, such that after Jefferson's 8 years, he gets succeeded by his best friend Madison for 8 years. He gets succeeded by his little brother figure Monroe for 8 years. Then there's a 4-year window for John Quincy Adams, but then there's 8 years of Andrew Jackson. So for the first 36 years of the 19th century, 32 of those years are Thomas Jefferson and his followers. He got America just to believe wholeheartedly in his vision for America, as evidenced by all those two-term presidents that followed him, who were his disciples. But obviously we now know all about what was going on at Monticello and the saga of Sally Hemings and his reluctance to even think about freeing his slaves. He did fulfill his commitment to Sally Hemings. Upon his death, the children that he had sired through her were freed, but it's hard to think about what that was like. I mean, on the one hand, there were many slave owners who thought they owned their slaves and thus they could do whatever they wanted with them. In fact, as many serious history lovers in this audience know, Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's wife had the same father. They were half-sisters. And so anyway, he wasn't the only guy who was deciding that that's what he wanted to do, but it's the worst. It's not the way. It's among the worst things you can imagine one human being doing to another, and he did it for an extended period of time, like over 40 years. So and just the whole hypocrisy of all men are created equal, and yet I got to have all these slaves, and I'm committed to slaves. And he said, no, slavery's evil, but we're not going to solve it during my lifetime. And I've got this big plantation, Monticello. The only way we can make it work is with workers, and I don't have that many children, and there weren't any European immigrants to supply a workforce. So the only people available to be in the workforce were slaves. It was permitted under the Constitution, so he could rationalize it and justify it. But it's not something that we look back with pride on. In fact, we look back with sorrow, but it's just part of the American story.
Mm-hmm. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he did something that really no other president has really done, especially none since him, that I can think of, that he surrounded himself, whether it be cabinet members, member of the military, his staff, with those he thought best equipped. Didn't matter what political party they represented. It also didn't seem to matter if they spoke very poorly of him and argued with him and had ill will toward him. Why do you think he did this, and how was he able to maintain grace while doing it?
Well, my book, 8 Presidents, an average of 3 leadership traits per president, a total of 24 different leadership traits that are covered in this book. And I could make an argument that Abe Lincoln had all 24. And I can't make that about any other president. And one of Washington's traits that I talk about is his incredible integrity and thus credibility. Well, obviously I could have said that about Lincoln. I could have said that about all these others. So I had to look for something that was unique to Reagan that I really wanted to profile. And so the traits for Lincoln, I talked about his magnanimity in terms of all these people, whether his team of rivals cabinet, whether it was the Union generals, whether it was his very difficult wife, Mary, who were just day in and day out creating all kinds of problems. And yet he never took the bait. He always took the high road. He was always conciliatory. He knew that to get involved in this kind of interpersonal friction was going to prevent him from doing his best as president at a critical time, Civil War. And then his equanimity, his calmness in a crisis. Here we are, the Civil War, 750,000 people lose their lives, millions are wounded, so many millions of amputees. This is the worst possible time in American history. And yet he never lost his cool, he never lost his panic. And then the third trait I talk about is how he was, when he made a promise, he always kept it. Many of you have read Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and then he wrote a follow-up called The 8th Habit, and he said, I could put all of those 7 habits together and make it one, and that is somebody who makes and keeps his promises. And that was Lincoln, so I talk about that in the chapter. But just operating on a higher plane, I talk in the book how you can make an argument, a good argument, that Lincoln was a genius in 4 different areas. Number one, he was a legal genius. He was a top trial and appellate lawyer, very successful, knew how to talk to juries, knew how to talk to judges, appellate judges, knew how to cross-examine witnesses, knew how to get the best results, knew when to settle when the facts were bad. You could also say he was a political genius. Here was a guy who had 1 2-year term in Congress, and then the next thing you know, he's President of the United States. So how he maneuvered to develop a national following that caused him in 1860 to get the Republican nomination and then win the election and then win a second term when he's been president during this disastrous war. And then third, you could say he was a military genius, because here he is, he got the Civil War. These generals in the Union Army, they're all top graduates of West Point. He assumes they know how to fight a war, but they don't. And they don't want to engage in battle, most famously McClellan. And so Lincoln says, I'm the commander-in-chief. So he goes over to the Library of Congress and reads all about military history, military strategy, and devises the whole new approach, the hard war, finds his general in Ulysses Grant, wins the war. And then fourth and finally, a little known or lesser known area of genius, he was a theological genius, recognized as such by Reinhold Niebuhr and others. And I'm sure you had Jon Meacham here, his most recent book on Lincoln, And There Was Light. That's the real theme of that book, is Lincoln's spiritual development during his presidency, which culminated with his second inaugural address, which has been called Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, where he quotes 4 scriptures and he makes constant reference to God and the need for prayer. And here he is, president, all these people dying and wounded, the whole chaos, and he's trying to say, how can a just and loving God allow this war to go on and all this devastation and loss? And he answers that in the second inaugural address. This is God's punishment for the fact that we've allowed slavery to be in this country for as long as it has. So, I mean, just off the charts, and people on the order of Tolstoy say things like, hey, I've studied all the great leaders in the history of the world, Alexander the Great, all of them. Nobody can compare with Lincoln. So that's why Lincoln is second to Jesus in the number of biographies about Abe Lincoln. And there's always a new angle that's so much fun to go into when we have great historians, whether Ronald White or Jon Meacham. It elevates you to think not only of his brilliance, but also of this emotional intelligence and this vision and this execution. That's why he's number one.
And of Teddy Roosevelt, one of the traits you call out is his mediation skills. What makes that a good trait for a leader?
Well, a great leader needs to be in the business of making peace and minimizing war. And so whenever there's major discord, the great leader knows how to bring it to an end sooner rather than later, as opposed to a long, drawn-out war. And so Theodore Roosevelt had been president for 1 year when all of a sudden there was this great national coal strike. All the coal miners went on strike. And so for a period of months, they would talk to the owners of the coal companies from time to time, but they weren't getting anywhere. And all of a sudden winter was coming, and if the coal strike remained, half the country was going to freeze to death because nobody had any coal. So no American president had ever gotten involved in a labor dispute before, but Theodore Roosevelt said, I got to do it. We're about to have this national disaster unless we bring an end to this strike. So he brings in the leaders of the coal miners, the leaders of the coal companies, and the skill of mediation, as Doris Kearns Goodwin talked about in her wonderful biography of Theodore Roosevelt, The Bully Pulpit. You've got to have this intense concentration and focus so as to be able to thoroughly hear and grasp what's keeping these parties apart. You've got to have the genius to think of new and different potential areas that they can find common ground on. And Theodore Roosevelt was probably our highest IQ president. He wrote more books than any president. He read more books than any president. Like Lincoln, he had a photographic memory. So he had this genius of coming up with alternatives until they could finally agree on something. And in the case of the coal strike, they agreed to binding arbitration of the issues that had led to the strike. End of strike, nobody freezes to death. And word gets around the world that this President Theodore Roosevelt, he can solve anything if he can solve this coal strike. So Japan and Russia are at war. People are dying. And they can't figure out how to begin to end this war. So they called Theodore Roosevelt into action. He does the same thing. He listens, he talks, he brainstorms, he creates potential ideas and brings an end to the Japan-Russia war and wins the Nobel Peace Prize. A couple years later, there's a big dispute in Morocco. He gets called in, he solves that. A couple years later, at the Hague Convention in the Netherlands. So just time after time after time, people who were hopelessly deadlocked, no way to bring an end to their war or dispute or whatever it was, and he found a way through his powers as a mediator.
So we've talked about Ronald Reagan's optimism. We watched that fun clip. He had 2 desk plaques on his Oval Office desk, one of course being "It Can Be Done," going back to his optimistic spirit. Now, President Eisenhower also had a desk plaque. His desk plaque was in Latin, but when translated, it read, "Gently in manner, strongly in deed." Can you discuss how this defined Eisenhower's character and leadership style?
Well, there are 2 major, I should say 3. 3 major instances during his presidency where that came into play. The first was McCarthyism. Harry Truman had been the president when McCarthy reared his ugly head and brought on the Red Scare and no basis, and yet, Truman's approach was to go head to head with him and insult him and call him a liar and all this stuff, and all that did was seem to elevate McCarthy's stature. And so Eisenhower becomes the president, and he's got to bring an end to McCarthyism. He despises McCarthy, but he doesn't want to do what Truman did because it hadn't worked. So he says, I'm not even going to mention the name McCarthy in public. What I am going to do is I'm going to devise a hidden hand strategy for bringing an end to this guy. It's going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient. But ultimately, it's going to be a plan that gives McCarthy enough rope to hang himself. And it culminated in the Army McCarthy hearings. And sure enough, it was the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, who brought down McCarthy, and Eisenhower never even had to get his hands dirty. So gently in manner, he's behind the scenes, not even talking about McCarthy. Strongly indeed, he brought him down. Another example, October 1956, a month before the election that would lead to Eisenhower's second term, our great allies, England, France, Israel, join forces, invade Egypt and seize the Suez Canal. And they do it even though Eisenhower has told them beforehand, don't do that. You're going to invite the Soviet Union into the Middle East. You're going to disrupt the balance of power in the Middle East. Do not do that. But they did it anyway. They thought, well, we've always been friends before. We were allies in World War II. We can get away with this. This is what we want to do. Well, as soon as they did it, Eisenhower goes to the United Nations. He gets severe economic sanctions imposed. This disrupts those countries. All of a sudden, they can't get access to all the oil they need. They reach out. President Eisenhower, we need some oil. He said, you should have thought about that before you invaded the Suez. You're not getting anything from us. Then their economies are disrupted. They said, President Eisenhower, could you loan us some dollars to help stabilize the British pound? He said, you should have thought about that before you invaded the Suez. You're not getting anything from me. That brought on a ceasefire, but the troops wouldn't leave. They wouldn't withdraw their troops. So that really ticked Eisenhower off. So he instructed his Secretary of the Treasury to go out into the marketplace and buy up all the British pounds that could be purchased. And he did. As soon as he finished that, he called the British Prime Minister and said, if you don't get all those troops out of the Suez right now, I'll drive your pound down to 0. Within a nanosecond, those troops were withdrawn, gently in manner, strongly indeed. And then third and finally, read about his handling of Little Rock and how Orville Faubus, wasn't going to allow the Little Rock 9 black children into the Central High School and was going to defy Brown versus Board of Education and thought he could get away with it. And Eisenhower gently had conversations with Faubus, but gently, got the needed court orders, and then finally sent in the U.S. military to allow the Little Rock 9. So again, gently in manner, strongly indeed. And those are landmark achievements. That's why Eisenhower is ranked our 5th greatest president, on top of the fact that after he brought an end to the Korean War and brought an end to McCarthyism, from then on it was smooth sailing, peace and prosperity. And so when he left the presidency, John F. Kennedy had run in 1960 saying, oh, this Eisenhower guy, he's too old, he just plays golf, other people are making all the decisions. And so the first presidential ranking poll that came out after Eisenhower left the presidency, he was ranked 22nd out of 34. He's a bottom 1/3 president, and yet today he's ranked number 5. You say, how'd that happen? Well, what happens is that when a president leaves the White House, his papers are kept confidential for a while. And when they were finally opened up to scholars of the American people, they said, oh my gosh, no, he was making all these decisions. He was in the big middle of everything. He is responsible for the peace and prosperity and the great results with McCarthyism and Suez and Little Rock and 8 years of peace and prosperity. That's a pretty hard thing to do. So Jon Meacham's next book, I just learned the last couple of days, is going to be on Eisenhower. And what a great subject matter. He is, so many times people say, Eisenhower, our 5th greatest president? I had no idea. Eisenhower was the first major figure to recognize Reagan's greatness. That 1964 A Time for Choosing speech, a week before the Goldwater election, when Reagan electrifies the world, and here's this presumably fading television movie star, all of a sudden is the most dynamic political speaker people had seen in quite some time. And Eisenhower seized on it and thought to himself, oh my gosh, we Republicans, we chose the wrong guy. We got Barry Goldwater. We could have had Ronald Reagan. And of course, in time, we got Ronald Reagan. But Eisenhower was always a big fan of Reagan's because he recognized the greatest. Reagan was the great orator that Eisenhower never was.
Yeah, he gave him a lot of advice. John F. Kennedy, the leadership trait that I really liked that you spoke about was staying calm in crisis.
Well, John F. Kennedy, people say, my gosh, this guy wasn't even president for 3 full years. He was only president for 1,000 days. How could he possibly be rated one of our greatest presidents in American history? And the answer is, look at the record. But in particular, calm in a crisis, obviously we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And going back to this idea of learning from mistakes, 3 months into JFK's presidency, we have the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where Kennedy has approved of sending these guerrilla insurgents who'd been trained by our CIA into the Bay of Pigs, and they're immediately seized and taken over by Castro's army, and it's just an international embarrassment. But back to the trait of Washington, Kennedy learned from his mistakes. His mistake had been he thought he should rely on the advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military leaders who were all saying, oh yeah, this is going to work, this is going to work, yeah, these insurgents, they'll get in there, and we know there's a lot of people in Cuba who don't like Castro, and man, when they see these insurgents, they're going to grab their guns and they're going to support them, and we'll defeat Castro's army. No, that's not the way it works. Look at same exact thinking that John Brown thought that by with 13 people going into Harper's Ferry, that all of the anti-slavery people across the country would immediately grab their arms and support this revolution. Exactly the same. But anyway, to Kennedy's credit, he knows it's a disaster. He knows he's responsible. He gets on national TV and says, folks, I blew it. I take responsibility. I'm the commander-in-chief. It was a bad decision, and I'm embarrassed, and all I can say is it'll never happen again. Miraculously, his approval ratings go up because he took responsibility for having screwed up. Isn't that a nice thing to think about when people, great leaders, can actually accept, as Reagan finally did on Iran-Contra? But anyway, so he learns from those mistakes, and then along comes the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he, with all these military leaders saying, we need to invade Cuba, we need to bomb Cuba, bring on World War III, bring on nuclear holocaust, and Kennedy opts for this blockade strategy, which prevents any missiles from coming into Cuba, and then he has these detailed negotiations with Khrushchev, which leads to the trade. We take our missiles out of Turkey, they take their missiles out of Cuba, nobody loses their lives, happy ending, no World War III, no nuclear holocaust. And at all times, John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, who was his Attorney General, unbeknownst to anybody else, was secretly recording the meetings of his executive committee. And the reason they did it was they wanted to have a record of it because they thought down the road they'd need to jog their memories when it came time to write their memoirs. They assumed that these recordings were going to be their own personal property and that they could do with them what they wished. Well, what happened, of course, U.S. v. Nixon, no, that's the government's property. Mm-hmm. So when these tapes of his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis came out in the 90s, and historians listened to them, whereas Bobby Kennedy, after John F. Kennedy got killed, Bobby Kennedy all of a sudden thought, you know what, I'm going to run for president. I'm going to make myself the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is all well documented and recognized. But then, of course, Bobby Kennedy got killed. So anyway, when they listened to these tapes, they realized Bobby Kennedy wasn't doing anything to bring an end to the Cuban Missile Crisis that amounted to anything. It was John F. Kennedy who was the cool head in the room, who kept things under control, who listened but made the best final decisions. And now these tapes absolutely establish that. So it's not a he said, she said, what's the real truth here? The tapes establish what the truth, and that is he was the one who brought on this fantastic results that avoided World War III.
So we have time for maybe one or two audience questions. So we're going to go there next. But my last question before we do that is looking at the 8 presidents, looking at great leaders overall, whether they're a president or not a president, are you able to distill like the one top leadership quality you think is most important in a leader?
No, but I'll distill the top 3. And the top 3 were all exemplified by all 8 of these presidents. Number 1, they were all great persuaders. To be a great leader, you got to be a great persuader. Now, some of them were great orators, some of them weren't, but they were great one-on-one in small groups like Thomas Jefferson and Eisenhower and George Washington and Theodore Roosevelt. Secondly, the great leaders have self-awareness. They know what their strengths are and they know what their weaknesses are. They think of ways that they can use their strengths. Reagan knew he was a great public speaker, a great persuader, and so he was always thinking of ways to use that extraordinary skill. But he also knew his weaknesses. He knew he wasn't a detail guy. He wasn't an organizer. So thank goodness, when you have this self-awareness and you know this isn't exactly my strength, you bring in somebody who's strong in the area where you're weak who can diminish that weakness. In Reagan's case, he brings in James Baker, his White House Chief of Staff, who's the ultimate detail guy and who stays on top of everything. And that's why his first term is so extraordinarily successful. And I think both Ronald and Nancy Reagan said that had Baker stayed on as White House Chief of Staff second term, there never would have been an Iran-Contra. So anyway, self-awareness. And then number 3, and this is the one that really should make us stop and think in 2024, all 8 of these presidents directed their policies toward the great American middle. Not to the far right, not to the far left. They realized this is how you make government work. You direct it to the great American middle. Per Ronald Reagan, you recognize you got to compromise somewhat off your principles if you ever want to make a deal. James Baker famously must have told me a half a dozen times how much Reagan would say this, almost as much as that story about the two boys and the optimist and the pessimist, but he would say, I'd rather have 80% of what I'm seeking than to go off the cliff with my flag flying. You're never going to get everything, and that's the problem with so many of today's politicians. They think they're a failure if they don't get everything, and so they get nothing. And so we don't get the laws we need, and we don't have the dialogue we need because there's an unwillingness to compromise. So to me, those are the three T's: effective persuader, self-awareness, and directing and recognizing the great American middle and making sure that's who you're talking to instead of people on the extremes.
Great answer. We do have a microphone in the back of the room, so if you have any questions, just raise your hand. There's one up here. Oh, hold on. Wait, hold on.
I generally don't need a mic.
It's the only way the people at home can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yes, my question is, what part do you think intellect plays in these 8 presidents, and them being the 8 great ones that is so well documented?
Well, all of these people were really smart. Both Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, it was said, had second-class intellect but first-class temperament. Although, as I explained, particularly in the Reagan chapter, he had a different kind of intelligence, unique perhaps, in terms of seeing things that other people didn't see. I don't know if that's a matter of intellect or if it's a matter of vision, or if it's a matter of being able to execute on the vision. But certainly, you don't want dummies in a leadership position. Ideally, you'd like to think that whoever the leader is the smartest guy in the room. Mm-hmm. Getting back to your question on Lincoln and the team of rivals, it didn't take long for the team of rivals to realize, even though we thought he was kind of a hick lawyer from Illinois who'd only been in Congress for 2 years, you didn't have to be around Abraham Lincoln very long to realize, no, he really is the smartest guy in the room. Same with Dwight Eisenhower. He really was the smartest guy in the room. Kennedy was brilliant. Theodore Roosevelt, I said, the highest IQ. But I mean, Washington never even went to college, but he was a great decision maker. He was a voracious reader. He was very thoughtful. He was very skilled at being able to take these conflicting viewpoints. I'm sure most people in this audience have seen the musical Hamilton. And you know that Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton and Secretary of the State Thomas Jefferson were in constant conflict and argument. And Washington, who viewed his job as being unifier in chief, said, look, I'm not going to, in front of this meeting, say, Hamilton, you're right, and Jefferson, you're wrong, or vice versa. That would just create more division. We don't need more division. What I am going to do is I'm going to tell you guys, go back to your office, write a detailed position paper explaining your position on this issue that you're arguing about, submit it to me, I'll read it, I'll reflect on it, I'll make the final decision. But I'm not going to be out in the forefront and taking sides, because all that's going to do is grow the division. And both Jefferson and Hamilton recognized in the final analysis, Washington was a great decision maker. Jefferson was off the charts brilliant. Lincoln, as I said, this is one of the great stories of America. Lincoln is recognized by everybody as our most eloquent president. No, not many people stop and think about, how in the world did he get to be so eloquent? This is a guy who had less than 1 year of formal schooling. As a child, he had been to the blab school where everybody's talking at the same time, nobody's learning anything. That was it. He didn't go to high school, college, law school, nothing. How did he get to be so eloquent? How did he get so brilliant? Well, number one, for a child, he was a voracious reader. Of course, his family was poor. Everybody who lived around him was poor. People might have 3 or 4 books in their house. They didn't have bookshelves full of books like we do now. But the books that everybody had in their house were the classic books. They were the King James Bible. They were Shakespeare's plays. They were books of the classic poets. They were Aesop's fable. And Lincoln would read and reread and reread. He had a photographic memory. He'd memorize large chunks of them that he could then work into conversations and speeches. Also his 23 legal career. Literally thousands of jury trials. He argued over 400 cases to the Illinois Supreme Court. And through that, he learned, number one, how to frame an argument If you're ever going to be in the business of making a presentation, you better know how to frame it so it's most likely to be persuasive. But also, as a lawyer, he learned you got to talk differently to different people and different audiences. You talk differently to a jury than you do to a judge, than you do to a witness, than you do to a client, than you do to opposing counsel. So when he's talking to farmers, he's talking down low. When he's talking to the elite New York businessmen at Cooper Union, he's speaking their language. That's what people can absorb. All these guys were definitely, I guess if you had to say who was the lowest intellect, it might be Franklin Roosevelt. And yet he was an amazing persuader and inspirer and optimist to get people out of the funk of the Great Depression, to get people to keep persevering through World War II, who could get people unstuck from isolationism like they were in the late 30s and early 40s, led by Charles Lindbergh, and to realize this Hitler guy is for real, and if we don't play our part, he's going to take over the rest of the world and come for us, and moving the needle on public sentiment from isolationism to internationalism. So extraordinary communication skills that causes him to be ranked as our third greatest president. So none of these people were dumb. They're all in their own ways top of their games.
So we only have about a minute left, but I have one last question. So this book is really a primer on leadership. You talk about each of the presidents, you talk about the traits, you end each chapter with questions of how people can figure out how to incorporate those leadership styles into their own lives. So I'm curious, after doing all the research and writing the book, if there is a new leadership trait or style you've incorporated into your life.
Oh my goodness. I guess it's just recognizing the importance in this world, in the importance of being able to build consensus and achieve resolution and get people unstuck from their perspectives and in a mode through relationship building of getting people into a mode where they're more likely to listen, they're more likely to have mutual respect, so forth. I had a woman 2 days ago come up to me and say, I hate one of the two presidential candidates. And I said, well, 50% of the American people are supporting him. I mean, you may feel that way about that person, but in this election where it's down to the wire and it's 50-50 and who in the world knows who's going to win, you may despise either or perhaps both of the candidates, but they got hundreds of millions of people who are supporting. They must be doing something right. They must have something that causes this support that both of them have. So let's get away from the personal attacks. Let's recognize that there's different ways to look at both domestic and foreign policy, and let's see if we can have a constructive dialogue that's going to make us less angry and better listeners and more thoughtful decision makers. So that's really where I think the rubber's meeting the road, particularly in the context of the 2024 polarization.
I want to thank you for coming. I want to encourage everyone to read this, not just for yourself, but maybe if you have a young adult in your life. It's a really great, as I just said a minute ago, leadership primer. So read it and pass it along. And thank you so much for joining us.
Oh,
really
my pleasure.
Appreciate it.